So the projects during my time there that kicked off to get this sorted out, new test framework, translating the test suite. So like that sort of like 20-ish hours collapsed into, I want to say like 90 minutes to 2 hours, like somewhere in there. Like it was a huge reduction.
What's your secret? This one weird trick.
I think don't have a massive test suite written in Perl. Like that might be like, that's not really, I don't really feel like that's a secret at this point, right? In 2022, like no one would really do that. I will also say I think it was like an early exposure to the danger of metrics, like your incentives.
All right, welcome back to another edition of the Sourcegraph podcast. Today we're here with Adam Berry. Adam has worked his entire career on developer tools and infrastructure, starting with Eclipse plugins for Wolfram Research and later moving into team-oriented tools that drastically lower cycle times, especially in organizations that reach scale in terms of humans and code. Over the years, he has had a front row seat to the evolution of deployment models from VMs to containers and the impact this has had on tooling, processes, and developer culture. And he has arrived at a framework through which he views engineering productivity at sort of two distinct levels, the individual and the organizational level, which hope we can get into in this next hour. Adam, thanks so much for taking the time and being on the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Awesome. So to kick things off, let's start with your programming background. What was your journey or entry point into the world of computers?
Yeah, so I think slightly atypically, I had computers around as a kid. I was lucky enough, like from a very young age, but I didn't actually really do any coding when I was young. Really, the entry for me was I graduated college with a degree in mathematics and moved to the States, and was lucky enough to have like moved essentially to the hometown of Wolfram Research, where I got an entry level position, and that was like my gateway into there. So mathematics, Wolfram, and it just kind of like took off from there.
Interesting. What sort of math were you studying in university?
So my focus was pure mathematics broadly. My master's thesis was in set theory and graph theory, sort of very specifically, but I think in a technical sense, a very long way from what I do for a living now.
Was that, like Wolfram Research, it has like a very mathematics oriented use case. Is that how you got connected to them, or like how did you get in the door there?
So back at that point in time, so Wolfram had this sort of like way that they hired new graduates into their technical support department. And so basically you would spend a couple of years in there working with most of the users of Mathematica, like the principal products at the time, learning the product, kind of like figuring that out, and then gradually you would transition into a development role. So that was like very much what I was able to do there. And tech support can sound kind of heinous, but it was like very much like the level 4 and up support, right? It's like you're working with researchers and professors who are like calling in like with very serious issues that they're having with the product. I mean, you have to do the install stuff too, but like it was actually a really good kind of like introduction to the field. And I've remained really thankful to that my whole career, because there is no better way to build empathy for someone who's using software than working with them on the phone when they're stuck. So like that's really sort of, I think, served me in good stead over the years.
Oh, absolutely. I feel like support is one of those roles which maybe gets like the short end of the stick, especially in the tech industry, but it's just so valuable. Like every time that I've hopped on a customer call, you just pick up so much context from the way that they're trying to use the product. They push the boundaries in interesting ways, or sometimes they're like things that are obvious to you that are just completely non-obvious to a user who's just, isn't on the product team or isn't on the support team.
Yeah, I think that's dead right. And then I think also when you think about like the organizational model that you have then, in that like a very high percentage of your developers have come into the organization through this path of working with your users. Like that's a really valuable thing that's like very difficult to capture, right? Normally, like, so, a couple of years of that, it's ingrained. So as you're then working on code and working on stuff, like you've got that muscle. It's really good.
I like that. Maybe every developer should start their career out in support, and
yeah, maybe
that's not a bad idea. Okay, cool. So, when you transitioned to a development role in there, what sort of things did you work on at Wolfram?
So that was really so the couple of things that I started on there included the Eclipse-based development tool that we had that was called Wolfram Workbench. So like I started working in on that. So that was like straight away I'm into developer tools on one side. I was also at the time working on a couple of other pieces. One was a Ample, which is like a modeling language into Mathematica translation tool. So like I was working on that at the time. But it very quickly got me into like the development tooling of the scope. It's like I don't really know why I was pulled into that space early on, but I was like literally day one.
So talk about that Eclipse plugin. What did it do? What was the thing that it added to Eclipse that was important to the dev team?
Yeah, so Mathematica has essentially a package mechanism for extending it for its core functionality, which actually dates to like the early days of Mathematica as a product where not everything could fit in memory. So like they built this package system so that you could like opt in like pieces of functionality. And it just sort of like stayed around as like, this is actually how we develop extensions and to a large extent develop the core of the product. So what was pulled into Eclipse then was the classic set of an editor that had support for the language, with good code completion, good reference finding, like all the things you would expect from an IDE editing experience. Also a unit testing framework so that you could do like proper test-driven development for those packages as you're going with it, and like properly embedding that in the development cycle inside of Eclipse. And then like run and debug both with like single local kernels and remote kernels, because one of the use cases of Mathematica is to run on parallel clusters, right? So like you could be developing custom code and like hook up to like debug across the cluster. Like, so very sort of like classical sets of things inside of the IDE, but just like translated to Mathematica.
Got it. So this really like tightly coupled Eclipse with the application that you're developing is kind of meant to be kind of like an end-to-end portal for testing and also like spinning things up in cluster environments, that sort of thing.
Yep, very much so.
How many people were working on this thing?
So basically 3 of us, which included the director of kernel technology. Like Wolfram, and I don't know if this is still true. I mean, I still have friends who work there, but like when I was working there, I don't want to say ran lean, actually. I think actually the way I want to say it is did an incredible amount with a really small number of people. And so like, I remember there was a guy who was an office mate of mine at the time, who was working on the statistical functionality inside of Mathematica. And he was actually essentially the lone developer for all of the statistics functionality in Mathematica, which could do pretty much everything you could do with SPSS. And it was like one guy, and SPSS had like, I don't know, dozens of people doing the equivalent functionality. So like there was a lot of that kind of translation of like the numbers of people who were working on things. So there was 3 of us who were doing it, and we were all also doing other things, including in one of the cases, running the whole of the kernel group. That's
incredible. I feel like that gets at like one of the interesting things about software work, whereas there is indeed like such a high level of variance between different individuals and different teams in terms of like how many people hours are required to ship, a particular set of functionality. Did you notice that at the time, or is that something that you kind of like became aware of? Did that factor into how you like develop the tooling at all?
So the latter part, no. I did know that we were running like this, right? And I think there was a little bit of it, as I think back of, well, hey, we just run cheaply here, right? Like that's just kind of how we do things. I think it's not until much later, right, as I've now worked at a bunch of places that I can look back and really put that into context and to understand the difference, right?
Cool. Okay, so after Wolfram, you left. You went to Yahoo. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. There was a small stint at a little startup in there in the middle, but I went back to Wolfram in between. But yeah, so my career arc is basically Wolfram and then Yahoo.
And so from Wolfram to Yahoo, it was kind of this journey from like this editor plugin, which is very much kind of like a single player tool, right? It's like, one developer sitting at your editor, and then in Yahoo, you got involved in more kind of like team based tools. Can you explain a little bit about what you're working on there?
Yeah, so I was on the release engineering team inside of the grid engineering team at Yahoo. So this was the group of people who developed Hadoop and Friends, basically, which for people who remember this history, Hadoop came out of Yahoo, right? So like this family of technology was birthed there. And so this is the group of people who were working and delivering on those things. And it was all of them. It was Hadoop, Hive, Uzi, Pig, the whole set. And so I was on the release engineering team in that group. My memory is it was something on the order of 50 or 60 developers, give or take. The grid operations team was another 15 to 20 or so, I think. And this is the group of people who are pushing, like essentially the core of the platform, Yahoo's data infrastructure, which is 40,000 nodes, give or take. So yeah, a very different kind of world to step into.
That's incredible. And what sort of things were you working on enabling for Yahoo? Like, in terms, it feels like almost like the early days of kind of the big data trend. Hadoop was kind of at the leading edge of that. What were some of the interesting use cases that you encountered there?
Yeah, so when I joined was right when the team was developing and delivering essentially Yarn. So like it was Hadoop.23 that then came Hadoop 2, which was like this new compute framework. So like I was like there right as that was going out. And so when I joined, there was already like the ideas to start attacking some of the things essentially in the delivery lifecycle for the team. So my manager like explicitly hired me and one other person into the team, was like, we need a new test framework. The current test suite is a nightmare. There's no way we can fix it in the current setup. So we're going to have to go tackle that. And so there was a few of these projects where we sort of ended up like tackling chunks of what I now know to be the delivery lifecycle, but we were not coining it in those terms at the time. So broadly, we just like did that. We like each chunk of the delivery lifecycle, we went in, we did something, we made it better. I think one of the really big things that I personally worked on in that realm as well that really informed a bunch was smoothing the management between the open source releases and the internal releases, right? There was a really strong tension there because this was the group of people who were developing essentially Yarn, or at least split with Hortonworks, right? Hortonworks did exist by this time. So there was like a co-development of the next gen compute framework. But you want to be able to deliver internal versions of open source releases with as small a number of fixes as possible. So like smoothing that process, getting really clear visibility into what your difference is internally over open source, and minimizing it, which was like the first time I started to think about collection of risk in the development process. So like that was one of the things that like I sort of personally did there. But yeah, we tackled the full chunk, and I was involved in all of it. It was a lot of fun.
That's interesting. I'm trying to paint a picture of like what the development environment looked like when you came in. So 40,000 nodes. That's like a huge cluster. It seems like there's
40,000 in prod. The prod was 40,000 nodes across like, I don't know, roughly 10 clusters, I think is my memory. And then in dev we had, I want to say up to about 10,000 nodes that we always got like, as hardware aged out of prod, we got them in dev. So our hardware was super unreliable, which was awesome.
That's fascinating. Like usually when people speak of dev environments, they're like, oh, my local machine, it's got 16 CPUs and bit of RAM, but like 10,000 nodes. That's what does it look like to have a development environment that's hooked up to 10,000 nodes?
Yeah. So basically what it was the inner loop there for developers, was like the classic Linux workstation under the desk, like as much power as you can throw at it, because just compiling Hadoop, all of it, was pretty expensive. So the compilation and what were broadly called unit tests, but as all large unit test suites in open source projects go, there was definitely some stuff in there that wasn't unit tests, so like they would get expensive. So like that was like the local, like the very local inner loop. And then pretty much every developer had access to a small number of development clusters that numbered typically a couple of dozen nodes, basically, that they could actually kind of like compile a Hadoop, fling it out like to test something out. That was like basically what they were doing, day in, day out. And then we also had sort of like slightly larger, like build and release clusters, right? So as well as these like personal clusters for the devs, like we had like stuff that occupied spaces in the stages of the pipeline, which wasn't really a pipeline. That like it was very much like, hey, so when I started, we were absolutely on a once a day cycle as a team.
Once a day meaning like you shipped once a day, or like it took like what was once a day? Once
a day was the team had a 1 a day iteration. So there was a nightly build. It got deployed onto a set of test clusters. The test suite would run. And so in essence, the team collectively had 1 iteration per day.
So that was like your inner loop. Like you couldn't even like try something out and like deploy it into a clustered environment. You had to wait a whole day?
You could do it, but not integrated with anybody else's changes, right? So you could be working on something, but like in an isolated sense, that loop was okay. But the ability to integrate those changes any more than once a day just wasn't there. And once a day was a little bit in the ideal state because the test suite took, like, my memory is pretty close to a full day. Like it was like a good 22 hour test suite. And it wasn't super reliable. So like you lost a decent chunk of days of like, was those test failures surreal? Or like, is it just a test suite, right? So that's why I think the test suite, like the manager at the time, and this was not like codified in metrics or any objectives. It was just like, I'm tired of losing days in my team to figuring out what's going on with this test suite. It needs to go, right? Like that was just very much his position.
Okay, so what did you do to like fix that or improve that situation?
So the projects during my time there that kicked off to get this sorted out, new test framework, translating the test suite. So like that sort of like 20-ish hours collapsed into, I want to say like 90 minutes to 2 hours, like somewhere in there. Like it was a huge reduction.
What's your secret? This one weird trick.
I think don't have a massive test suite written in Perl. Like that might be like, that's not really, I don't really feel like that's a secret at this point, right?
Yeah,
like in 2022, like no one would really do that. I will also say I think it was like an early exposure to the danger of metrics, like your incentives. Cause I know that test suite came to be because a director had said, in 3 months, we will have 1,000 tests. So they did.
Wow.
But like, 2 years later, it's not performing very well. Right. So that was like, so basically it was like a new test framework was written in Java, which like, so integer unit, which also then aligns with the stack of Hadoop and friends that was all written in Java, right? So like, there's a good lesson, right? As you're thinking about productivity tooling, choose stacks that align with your team. Like that's a really important lesson. So that was like one effort. As Hadoop was evolving, as I said, the compilation and the unit test time was climbing. So there was an effort to heavily parallelize the unit test runs across like essentially a Jenkins cluster using Maven natively. So that got the unit test down from like what was getting to a few hours to like 25, 30 minutes. That's super important. So like that was 2 efforts. I also actually worked on, so as well as this like test suite in Perl, we also had deployment code that was like 10,000 lines of Perl and Shell like mixed together. I worked on some Chef cookbook code to like collapse a bunch of that, which also like was much less code and actually deployed quicker. So like we really just went after every single piece of this. And the end of this, before I left, we'd basically gotten down to an iteration cycle could be done in about 2 hours. So we'd gone from like the team had an iteration cycle once per day, best case scenario, to they had 4 or 5 in a typical working day. And that's a huge difference, right? Like, if you've never felt like that order of magnitude jump in your career, like it is an amazing thing to be around.
Okay, so I have 2 questions here. One is around the point you made earlier about metrics. I think that's really interesting. But before that, it sounds like you were working in what was effectively a sizable code base yourself that was composed mainly of Perl and Bash. How the heck did you get productive in that environment? Yeah, like those 2 languages are notoriously known for being like, optimized for write, but very difficult to read and understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think the brutal truth here is by doing as much of it in other things as I possibly could, right? Like that was not a code base that was to your point accessible, right? If you've come to it later, and this is also a point in my career where it's like I'm a little bit new to like managing infrastructure. Like this is a bit new to me, and so but luckily at the time things like Chef are growing in popularity. They already had a ramp at Yahoo. We also had like the beginnings of an OpenStack deployment internally, like with VMs. So it was like I was able to just kind of go, you know what? I'm going to make on-demand clusters for this portion of the test suite work much better, right? So it was like, and it's honestly ridiculous, right? That like I could do the equivalent deploy with, my memory is something like 700 lines of Chef and another 100 lines of like, I think it was like a Python script that I wrapped around this for managing the OpenStack deployment. Like truly ridiculous how much less code it was.
Yeah, it's almost like you got the same functionality, but taking on a lot less liability because you're able to reduce the amount of code that yielded that functionality.
Yeah, and then the other sort of side effect of this as well was the way the Perl and Shell actually deployed code when it was operating was really awkward in that the output that you got from the log was actually just telling you what commands it was executing remotely. So you never actually saw the output of the commands. You just saw what it tried to run and then the results.
Where it stopped.
Yeah. So like not only was Chef less code, but it was also like a very, very descriptive output as to what it tried to do. And if it failed, how it failed, right? Like you just sort of get this by default. So not only was like the cognitive load on the front end much less, the cognitive load of figuring out what had gone wrong was light years ahead as well, right? So, so like, that was like my first sort of like inkling of like, hey, there's a modernization happening in this tooling. And if that's how the old world looks, I'm never, ever going to touch it. I'm only going forward.
I feel like that certainly puts modern infrastructure pain points into perspective a bit. I still like to complain a lot about, dealing with AWS and whatnot. But, it certainly was a lot worse not that long ago. On the question of metrics, like that is a very hot debated topic, and what you're saying is absolutely true. Like a lot of organizations, I think, make this mistake of over optimizing for a metric. I guess my question to you is like, what is the right way to use metrics? Because obviously, like there maybe is a place for them. Like we're very much in a data-driven world. Hadoop played a big part in driving that. So, like, what is the appropriate way to use metrics? Like, do you not use them at all? And if you don't use metrics, like, how do you actually keep yourself honest as to the result that you're driving?
Yeah. So my general philosophy on this is what I call data informed, for both decision making and essentially progress tracking. Right. I think it's very important to have them. But you must always continue to put them into context. And that actually sort of forces you to go through this like renewal process of making sure they're telling you what you think they're telling you. I think, metrics that you can sort of directly impact will never be valuable because they're just too easy to gain, right? Like, you've got to be very careful about proxy metrics that aren't really measuring the thing that you're interested in, right? So there's a bunch of these like things you got to be careful about. But I'm actually like I really do like working generally under like an OKR system, for sort of like, but because it forces you to put it in that context, right? Like the objective is, this is north, this is where we're going. My key results, when designed well, are both like, how am I going to measure my progress in that direction? And the part that I've mostly seen people miss out on is you must also declare constraints, right? You want to declare progress and the things you want to not see go sideways, right? Like you need to do both of those things. And I think if you're sort of in a good like rhythm of going through that process, I think it's really, really valuable. I think tossing up metrics as like absolute measures of performance and then using them to like as sticks across teams is awful. I've definitely seen that. But so there's lots I can tell you about how not to do it. OKRs is broadly like how I think is good.
Can you maybe talk about how you applied that in a specific example? So for example, when you started working on the Hadoop development environment and, that team had gotten to a bad place, or like the I guess like testing cycle had gotten to a bad place because of mismanagement of metrics. When you were, trying to fix that situation and get the cycle time from, once a day to multiple times per day, did you have metrics that you were looking at as like informative or validators at that point?
Yeah, so we were, but not in like that formal of a way, right? Like we started to track build times, we started to track like test times and test failure rates, but in a relatively ad hoc way, right? It was how we would declare success and move on. Is like we would do the analysis and be like, okay, is this trended like where we wanted it to? And like we would move on. We weren't doing anything like emitting data and like building, dashboards and alerts. Like there was none of that was happening. But like there was definitely points in time where we would do that analysis to be like, okay, have we tackled the problem we thought we were tackling? And if yes, we would just move on. Right, and like assume it would stay good from that point.
Did you run into any issues of like, so inside a 60-person org, I feel like that's enough people for there to be communication difficulties, like people interpreting, your stated goals in different ways, and sometimes like metrics are thrown out as a way to just like make it crystal clear, like what is the number that we care about. Did that occur at all, or was it? Were you able to like work through kind of like the nuances?
Weirdly, we didn't really have that in that group of people. I agree with you. It is a large enough group of people where it could have happened, but I don't ever actually remember feeling like that was the thing that we went.
Okay,
maybe
everyone just got it. Like they just were. You were on the same page.
It felt a little bit more the org was big enough and busy enough that everybody was just like, I got my stuff. I trust you to have your stuff.
Got it.
Like come back and report progress and cool, right? It was a bit more like that dynamic, I think, than sort of like everybody got it.
Cool. One of the other things you mentioned was, transitioning over to Sheffer for deployment. I feel like, over the course of your career, you've seen, I guess now we're like several iterations, past Chef in terms of, the technologies we're using to provision and orchestrate environments. Can you talk a little bit about just like your view of this whole evolution?
Yeah. So I think, broadly speaking, it's a really clear place where you can see the effect of tooling in terms of the amount of stuff an individual can manage. And I've seen these talks, or like I used to watch them back in the day when Chef was still like a thing, and I remember some of the folks would sort of put up their slides. It was like, in the olden days, we had Ye Olde Runbook, right? And then somebody would take Ye Olde Runbook and write Perl and Bash, right? Like that was like, this was like the next step in the evolution was like Perl and Bash. And then after that, someone would be like, okay, for the config management piece of this, because it's important to remember that Chef at that time didn't really do provisioning or actually orchestration. It was very strictly, in essence, a config management tool on individual nodes, right? Like provisioning and orchestration was like an exercise left to the user, which is like terrifying because there's a huge domain, right? But just getting to that point, you could essentially, an individual sysadmin who in ye olde runbook days probably handled a couple of dozen nodes. If they'd gotten to the scripting stage, they were probably handling a couple of hundred. If you've graduated to like config management tools like Chef or Puppet or like any of that like generation of tooling, you'd be in a couple of thousand nodes sort of per operator, right? So you've got these like step shifts in like orders of magnitude of like stuff that you can manage, right? The stuff hasn't changed really, right? Like it's still in essence nodes. You're installing packages, you're laying down config files, it's running some services. The stuff hasn't changed. You're just doing more of it, right? Like you're just managing more of it because the tooling is reducing your cognitive load to get there. And it definitely carries on from there, right? Like as we figure out like the next set of stuff as we head into immutable infra patterns around VMs, like AWS and everything that brought to us around cloud native and like containers, and then into which was like a continuation of that pattern. And it's also like taking us into a pattern where like number of nodes per person is not a meaningful view of this space, right? It hasn't been for a while. But like that's really, I think, the progression that you can see as an industry.
Do you have a guess as to like what is next? Like now we're in, like from my point of view, it feels like, okay, the Chef thing is about ensuring the environment in the VM was set up properly, and then it was a little bit about provisioning infrastructure, I think a bit, and then Docker came along and it was like very much like a container based world all of a sudden, and then we got Kubernetes for orchestrating, and now there's like this new like serverless thing, which is there's a lot of things that term is doing a lot of work.
Yes.
Like what in your view are you most excited about, I guess, is what I'm asking on the horizon.
So actually, to me, the exciting thing about like what's happening in like that set of infrastructure stuff isn't actually so much about what's happening in the prod side. Like I think there's like a natural, like to broadly categorize, like we're done writing something, it's running now, right? Like that's sort of like the prod side. It's a really bad term. We need better terms for these things. But I actually think what's really fascinating right now about this work is that it's pushing techniques of repeatability further left in the development process. This to me is what's fascinating about this, right? To get more specific about that, things like the dev container work inside of VS Code, which is like relatively recent, right? Like when you sort of unpack what that is, that's like, oh, we actually want to make the environment for your inner loop a thing that we define in code, we share it, it's repeatable, it's testable, and it's used everywhere. Like, so it's not so much about like unifying that environment to like what the production thing is. To me, it's the application of those techniques that I think is like super interesting about how we can grow as an industry.
Yeah, that is interesting. It's like almost like pushing it. It's almost like, if you buy into like the dev ops breakdown of the development cycle, it's almost like there are a lot of innovations that we made on the ops side of things in recent years, and now some of those are starting to be applied to the development side and quickening the iteration loop in the early stages of the development cycle.
I think Kubernetes, the various serverless products / frameworks out there, broadly speaking, that's a developer doesn't care where things run sort of scenario. But that I'm not going to claim that's a given at this point, because like that's still probably like early adopter / early majority stage in like the adoption curve. But I think we can all see that it's heading there, right? Like it's like we can definitely see like the path to that. So I don't think there's any controversy in just being like, yeah, like there's gonna be a time fairly soon where developers are in the large are not going to care about that. It's not going to be their business. That's great. That's awesome, with some caveats. But I think like the techniques of that Yeah. Like bringing those techniques. Yeah. Shifting left. A technique shift left is a very interesting phase to be in. And I really think that's what we're looking at.
Yeah. We've talked a fair bit about team-based tooling that is focused on the operational aspects of code. So like getting things through the, testing pipeline and deploying and orchestrating them in production. I think you've also done a fair bit of work on just like the source code level side of things. Like when we were chatting earlier, you had this kind of interesting framework of like, viewing source code as like an asset management task almost. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like what is the way in which you view source code, and what are some of the like tools that you think are good for, being effective in that part of development?
Yeah. So I think, the first lens I'll give you this answer from is like from the org level, right? I think in most tech companies, I don't think it's controversial to say that your assets are principally code and data, right? Like literally the value for like, this was certainly true of companies like Pinterest. It's certainly true of companies like Facebook, right? Like that's it. The entire value of your business is your code and your data. And the data comes from your user base, right? But like the user base therefore generates the asset class, right? That is the data, right? And what's really sort of interesting about this, like when you start to think about like the risk management side of like, okay, so that's a massive financial asset class that we as a business have that defines our value. Start thinking about if we feel like we've got comfortable techniques for dealing with it. And pretty quickly, like some things start to pop as like significant issues. I think, like I've been involved in a couple of like earlier acquisition stuff, right? In my career, which were interesting because like there was, let's scan the open source licenses that you have in your code base and in your package repositories, and we'll call that good enough. And I'm like, hold up, if you're buying a business, that's not remotely close enough to like looking at that, like most of the asset class of what you're buying, that just doesn't cover it, right? And but the thing is when you start to think about that, we actually as engineering orgs don't really tackle this, right, by default. And we only have to look back to like very recent examples of things like Log4Shell to think, we don't have a handle on this as an industry at all. Like we just don't. We're not, and that's just the risk side, right? Because obviously when you think about an asset class, you want to think about, okay, what's my risk? What's my exposure here? But what's my return on investment? And what's my cost of managing this, right? Like you want to be thinking about these things at the organizational level about this. And yes, you have human beings that create this code, right? And we know what the cost of those are, but we don't sort of like translate that into this view of the code base. I don't really have this figured out. It's a thing I'm thinking about as like, hey, I think we've got to start treating this actually as a financial asset class, because you know what it is.
I think that's a really good framing, and it reminds me of kind of like the 2008 financial crisis, where I actually started my career working inside large banks that were in the aftermath of that crisis, and were building software to help them like manage they thought they had been acquiring these assets in the form of mortgage portfolios, but like to your point, like they didn't really peek underneath the hood and understand what like they did the surface level scan and it looked fine, but they didn't really poke into the code itself. And what they thought was an asset they were acquiring was actually this giant liability that was it was basically existential amount of liability. And I feel like code is the same way. Like, it was something like security, Log4Shell. If you're pulling in a dependency to add, an incremental piece of functionality, there's an incremental upside there, but like a huge catastrophic downside that you're pulling in. And I don't feel like, developers, we as an industry have internalized that view of things. Right.
And then this is how this starts to transition into the individual view, because I think it's probably unlikely that that code represents like a cliff liability in the way that those mortgage portfolios did, like heading into.
Sure.
Like, I mean, I hope that statement's true, but like I and I suspect it is, but you know, I wouldn't know how to prove that. But I think when you start then to think about, okay, from the individual's perspective, like what's happening here as well, right, is we are only increasing the amount of code an individual developer has to deal with, right? Like this aforementioned, so even though our tools are providing these step shift reductions in amount of code per task, the sizes of our code bases actually like continue to grow past like individuals, right? So like because we're generating a lot more stuff, right? So even though the tools are getting massively better, we're still creating more, right? And so slight organizational detour. We don't have enough software developers in the world. We can't grow enough quickly enough to counteract this problem. No, it's not going to happen. So what we have to continue to do is think about, okay, how can I make it so an individual can deal with more code? Like, because this is just going to continue to be weight. It's going to continue to be risk. It's going to continue to be like all of these like other issues. And there's no economic force pushing in the other direction on this. Like there just isn't one, right? So so from the code side, from the individual side, I spend a lot of time thinking about how do I make this like so you can actually just navigate this stuff.
Yeah, I think to the earlier point too of like the variance in developer productivity, I feel like tooling almost can amplify that insofar as like if you can make, you know, an engineer 10 times more effective, that is way better than hiring 10 times the amount of engineers. Just because like if you have one person owning it, it's like in one mind, they can actually like once you have multiple people in the mix, at the like gap between people, I think that's where the gaps emerge, and that's where like the liability and risk emerges as well, because there's no like strong like ownership at the kind of boundaries between individual scopes of responsibility.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot in that. I think ownership is like a really interesting topic, because I think as these code bases sort of like continue to grow, that becomes a murkier and murkier sort of way to think about your code base, right? It becomes far more important that you're able to move around as an individual, as a team even, right, into different areas. And I think, I've definitely been around organizations like operating on this tension. And I don't think there's a good sort of like way out of this right now. I think there's some interesting things to think about in applying like zero trust security models into like a zero ownership model on top of like code bases. But that it's a really tough sell. Developers think they own things, right? Like, so like it's a huge cultural shift for engineers to be like, yeah, no, I want you to operate without that. Like I'm going to take that entirely away from you. Like that's a huge shift.
So I kind of want to just like selfishly ask you. So like you've used Sourcegraph actually at a couple of companies that you worked with. You actually brought us in, I believe, to both Nutanix or Pinterest, and also perhaps Amplitude. I forget. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so Amplitude, like I've only been there a few weeks, so like we've not had that conversation yet. I was involved in bringing it in to Nutanix, but I wasn't the only one. I was, in fact, the person who ran point on bringing it into Pinterest because, like, I'd already become a believer, and we had the same set of problems. Yeah. I mean, you're welcome, but also, like, there was a reason behind that, right? And this is where I'll actually tell you, like, straight. I think calling Sourcegraph a code search tool is an undersell. That isn't, to me, what it's about.
We have so many discussions about this internally, but yeah.
Yeah, I know, and I've had some of them with some of you folks. But to me, it's sort of like a newer breed of what, and I think you've used this term, a code intelligence tool or a code intelligence platform, and that's really more of how I think about it. Because, like, yes, I want to give to an individual developer a tool that makes it easier to find things, right? And to navigate code bases. And Sourcegraph is best in breed. No questions asked in that space, right? But when you also then start to think about some of the larger scale things inside of an org, that start to tie into these asset management questions, like things like there are code patterns that are not going to be okay. So you kind of want to, and yes, you can get some of these things into linters and formatters and testers, but if you're a large tech company and you've got several different technology stacks, applying that evenly is really actually quite challenging across your stacks, right? So, and actually, they tend to drop a little bit late in the process as well, as to when to find them. So, Sourcegraph, from that point of view, to me, is like a really interesting point in the life cycle to be like, yeah, okay, I'm just gonna find things that I don't like, flag them, and we'll track them. I think the other thing that it really stands out to me is in doing migrations. So when you're rolling out a new platform, even internally in large companies, it's a huge deal, right? And one of the things that has to get done is find all of the people who are consuming, in essence, your API and get them to move. That's Sourcegraph does that really well. And particularly compared to the old school method of let's just build a spreadsheet and go door to door, which sucks. And I've been around a bunch. It's just a far more powerful way of going about it.
What don't we do well? And in particular, what you were saying earlier about code as asset management and enabling, teams and leaders to really think about code in this way, think about the liabilities and address them. I feel like we're still a long ways from fully realizing that vision. Is there anything that you think we should be doing that would be really value add to engineering organizations?
That's a really interesting question. I think the first thing that kind of comes to mind is to draw an analogy with GitHub Copilot, right? Which whilst there's some controversy around this, right? But we'll just leave that to one side for a second.
Leave aside the license questions.
Yeah. But in essence, right? If you can get to a world where you've got this shared pool of patterns in code bases that are stuff we need to stop doing as an industry, Sourcegraph is a great way to kind of collect and redistribute those, right? As a platform, it could be that, right? Now there's a bunch of challenging issues there around crossing enterprise lines and a bunch of other stuff for sure, right? But you're in kind of a unique position to sort of think about that problem space, I think.
This would be essentially a database of anti-patterns.
Yeah. Because Copilot is the database of generational patterns, right?
Yes,
let's take this code and and
generate the boilerplate or the thing that we think you're trying to do.
Right. But if you sort of think of the dark side of that equation of what's the set of stuff that we have to stop from happening?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Because over time, right, I think customers like me, we're going to build up this set of code patterns where we're this must not happen in my org. And I would be willing to bet the house there's going to be a lot of similarity across those patterns across different companies. But we're all going to reinvent them, right? We're going to recreate them ourselves, which is both expensive and error prone.
What other tools do you think are useful in this domain? Aside from Sourcegraph, have you encountered any other tools that are very helpful in kind of thinking about code at kind of a high level or organizational level?
I don't have anything this really top of mind right now. There's a couple of things that I'm sort of watching out for to see how they play out at a bit more on the individual level. And I know you had I can't remember his name, but you had one of the co-founders of Zed on a few weeks ago. And so so Zed is a collaborative editing platform, has a lot of interest for me because it tackles, in one sense, to me
have you tried it out?
No, not yet.
Okay, yeah, I'm on the wait list as well, but it seems really interesting. When I spoke with Max, it's almost it's probably more than a year ago now. It was still quite early stages, but it seems like it's like the Atom team has like, got the band back together and trying to like follow through on the original vision for Atom, which is really exciting.
Yeah, and that's part of why I'm interested in that team, right? Is because like that history of Atom and GitHub and like some of the other things that they were tackling through there, right? It's like if they're coming out, like, is there going to be like a step shift in how we think about that end of the problem? That's a super interesting space, I think. But I don't. There's not a lot of other things out there right now that are really standing out to me. It's like, oh yeah, this thing is super helpful in, just making Git easier to work with at scale, in essence. And there's like an interesting conversation as to why companies keep descending on like these very large repos and using Git for it, which is like not actually really very well suited to this. It does it surprisingly well, but you do definitely start to hit some issues sort of along the way.
Is there almost like a black pill on Git here where it's like at a certain scale you should be using like Perforce or something like that?
I mean, that would be like a really controversial statement, I think.
Yeah. I'm trying to push you towards controversy.
Sure. No,
we'll get more listeners that
way. I think there's definitely a pill where we have to go to something else. Now, I know that like in Google's history, they went from Perforce to they now build their own source control system, right? Like, so that was
Piper. Yeah.
So that was like Google's journey. I think the issues with Git is that it's not really designed to do mono repos at scale, right? And like it was built to solve a very particular itch, right? And it does it really well, and it's and a flexible model that's grown really very impressively, right? Really has. I love Git. I love the model. I've loved it. I've used it for a long time. I love it. But working in large repos and large orgs is just painful, right? Like there's always just like these weird things that you end up finding. And particularly if you operate like a Git hosting service internally, which I've now done a couple of times with a couple of different tools, which just Gerrit and Fabricator, I've had experience now operating. I don't ever want to do it again. Really, I don't ever want to do it again.
It is interesting. We deal with a lot of customers with very large code bases. Some of them have their like own custom fork of Git where they've, forked it and replaced some of the like parts that are bottlenecks. Others are like, we see a bunch of different version control systems, Perforce, CVS, and other ones. It's, if you just look at the open source world, you might get a sense that like everyone's on Git, but like I actually think a good deal of the private code in the world is on non-Git based repositories, especially for large code bases. And you made a point when we were just like chatting earlier before the show about kind of like the need to build custom tooling at a certain point, especially in like I think the way you put it is like large single product organizations. You at a certain point you reach this point where like the off the shelf tooling no longer scales to your needs, and you almost have to like build the custom stuff.
Yeah, there's not a clear line in here, right? But like you definitely get into these spaces where the things that are special about you as a culture and an org mean that you're now far enough in terms of like habits and workflows from standards that like just off the shelf tooling just isn't gonna cut it, right? You may be able to drop some things into certain pockets, but you're definitely gonna be writing at minimum custom glue, at absolute minimum, like custom glue that maps between them, and that code tends to be like dark code. Like a lot of people don't. It's tough for orgs to.
There be dragons.
Yeah, it's tough for orgs to see. We don't necessarily think about proper delivery patterns for it, right? So, and I think honestly, like the easiest to understand example of this for everyone is like essentially build pipeline code is like actually where this manifests first in every org, because we don't build good life cycles around like evolving pipelines. like it's a really and obviously like speaks very close to my heart because I've spent a ton of my career working on these things, and they're really difficult to evolve. I think it's getting better. I think GitHub Actions and the like are a massive advance over Jenkins in terms of the developer experience of working on pipelines. I'm very optimistic about Dagger. I don't know if you've picked that up at all, but like I'm very optimistic about where that's heading as a viewpoint. But it's yeah, there's a lot of these places where we don't recognize that's going to be a cost, right? There's a bit of an assumption. It's like, oh, we can just pick up 3 or 4 tools and we'll be able to do what we need to do. And it's just not how these things work. And particularly when you've already got, you're up to 1,000 people, you've got 10 years behind you, you're in a weird place now. Like you will be in a weird place, like just kind of by definition. And it's, the worst thing is like what you really want to be able to do is back out from like 3 of those weird choices, right? So you can start picking up some standard things again. But that's like, it's nearly always cost prohibitive normally in time, right? Time is normally the cost that you can't absorb.
All right. So we're coming up at the end of the hour here. As kind of like a parting thought, is there any like tool or maybe like a blog post or maybe even like a Twitter account that you would recommend people checking out if they're interested in just like kind of continuing the thread here, like thinking about code at like a high level, like in terms of like asset management, that you think is like a particularly good resource for shifting the way about how people view large code bases and how to manage them effectively?
I don't know that I have like a single point of entry, honestly. I think, if people haven't read like the 2nd edition of the DevOps Handbook, start there. And because like that's really the best of knowledge that we have as an industry right now about how we deliver and develop what we work on. And the set of references that book has and the people who did that, right? Like, and if instead of like reading the DevOps Handbook, Gene Kim's podcast, that would be the listen. Go listen to that. Cause like, that's like the systems thinking. Let's just take systems thinking to everything that we do. So I think like those would be my 2 things of like, if you haven't picked these 2 things up, go pick them up. They will take you to good places for sure.
I'll check those out. Adam, thanks so much for taking the time to chat today.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.